The air inside the Beverly Hills ballroom hummed with a kind of quiet electricity, the kind that doesn't crackle out loud but settles in your chest like a held breath. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in crisp white linen, each one dotted with flickering candles and name cards printed in elegant script. Waiters moved like shadows between the guests, balancing trays of champagne flutes that caught the light with every careful step. It was one of those nights where everyone seemed to be someone. Producers with decades of hits behind them, actors whose faces had lived in living rooms for generations, directors whose names alone could greenlight a film. And yet, despite all the noise of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, there was a stillness at one corner table near the back. There, sitting with his hands folded loosely in his lap, was Clint Eastwood. He wore a simple black suit, no flashy lapel pins, no designer sunglasses tucked into his breast pocket, just the kind of outfit a man might wear to a nice dinner if he didn't want to draw attention to himself. His silver hair was neatly combed, his posture relaxed but alert, like someone used to watching more than being watched. He hadn't said much since arriving, just nodded politely to a few familiar faces and accepted a glass of water from a passing server. Most of the room hadn't even noticed he was there. In a space full of people vying for the spotlight, he seemed content to stay just outside its reach. Up on stage, the evening's host was getting ready to kick things off. Known for his quick wit and fearless roasting style, he'd built a career on saying the things others wouldn't dare whisper. He paced backstage, adjusting his cufflinks and running through his opening lines one last time. His team hovered nearby, offering last-minute suggestions and checking his mic pack. "You're gonna kill out there," one of them said with a grin. He smiled back, but his eyes flicked toward the ballroom doors. He knew Eastwood was in the audience. He'd seen the seating chart, and he'd already decided to work him into the monologue. When the lights dimmed and the music swelled, the crowd quieted with practiced ease. The host strode onto the stage to thunderous applause, flashing that easy, confident smile the cameras loved. He opened with a few safe jabs, gentle pokes at award season fashion, the usual jokes about how long the speeches tend to run, a playful dig at a streaming service that kept changing its name. The audience laughed warmly, settling in for what they expected. A polished, professional set from a pro who knew exactly how far to push without tipping over. Then he paused, scanning the room like he'd just remembered something. His eyes landed on Eastwood's table. A slow grin spread across his face. "You know," he began, voice dropping just enough to pull the room in, "I almost didn't recognize one of our legends tonight." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. "I mean, look at him, sitting back there like he just rode in from the set of High Plains Drifter. I swear if I leaned over I'd probably find a six-shooter tucked under that jacket." He mimed, drawing a gun from his hip, then added with a wink, "Just in case someone says something about cancel culture." The room erupted. Laughter rolled through the tables, some genuine, some nervous, some just going along because it felt expected. It wasn't a cruel joke, not exactly. More like a caricature dressed up as affection. Everyone knew the image, the tough, no-nonsense cowboy who spoke in grunts and squints. It was easy to play that version for laughs, especially in a room full of people who'd grown up watching him on screen. But as the laughter faded, the camera cut to Eastwood. He hadn't moved. Not a muscle. His expression hadn't shifted into a frown or a scowl. He didn't look angry. He just looked present, like someone who'd heard 1,000 versions of that same line over the years, and had long since stopped needing to react to any of them. His eyes met the host's for just a second, before he turned slightly to say something quiet to the person beside him. It was such a small gesture, but it carried weight. In a room full of performance, he was the only one not playing a part. Backstage, a producer watching the monitors let out a low whistle. "He's not laughing," she murmured to no one in particular. Another staffer shrugged.
"He never does."
"That's just Clint." But there was a tension in the air now, subtle but real. The host had thrown a stone into still water, and even if the ripples weren't visible yet, they were coming. The rest of the monologue rolled on. Jokes about box office flops, playful teasing of a famous director known for long takes, a bit about how no one really knows what best original screenplay means anyway. The crowd stayed engaged, but a few people kept glancing toward the back table as if waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eastwood sipped his water, listened politely when others spoke, and gave a small nod whenever someone caught his eye. He wasn't ignoring the room. He was simply occupying it on his own terms. Meanwhile, the host wrapped up his set with a flourish, bowing to another round of applause before stepping aside to introduce the first presenter. As he walked off stage, his smile stayed in place, but his shoulders were a little tighter than before. He'd expected a laugh, maybe even a raised eyebrow from Eastwood, but not that quiet, unshaken stillness. It was harder to read than any glare. Out in the audience, a young screenwriter leaned over to her friend and whispered, "Did you see that?" He didn't even flinch. Her friend nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think the joke landed differently than he thought." It wasn't about offense, it was about respect. There's a difference between laughing with someone and laughing at the idea of them. And in that moment, the room seemed to sense it too. The night carried on. Awards were handed out, speeches were given, tears were shed and quickly dabbed away with cocktail napkins. But that brief exchange lingered like a quiet echo beneath everything else. Because in a world that often confuses volume for strength, Clint Eastwood had just reminded everyone what real presence looks like. Not loud, not performative, just deeply, undeniably there. And sometimes that's enough to shift the whole room without saying a word. The host returned to the stage a little while later, this time to introduce a musical performance. He'd shaken off the slight unease from earlier, or so it seemed. His smile was back in full force, his timing crisp, his energy bouncing off the walls like he owned the room. And in many ways he did. He'd been chosen for this gig because he knew how to read a crowd, how to pivot when a joke didn't land, how to keep things moving even when the air got thick. But something about that quiet glance from the back table had stuck with him. Like a pebble in his shoe he couldn't quite shake. He finished his intro with a flourish, stepping aside as the lights dimmed for the singer. As he walked off stage, he passed a row of monitors showing live feeds from the ballroom. One frame caught his eye. Clint Eastwood, still seated, hands resting on the table, watching the stage with the same calm focus he'd had all evening. No smirk, no eye roll, just attention. It was unnerving in the best possible way. The host had spent years mastering the art of commanding a room, but this man commanded it by doing almost nothing at all. Back at his seat, the host sipped his water and tried to refocus. The night was going well overall. Laughter came easily, the pacing felt right, and the audience was warm. But his mind kept circling back to that joke. Had it been too much? Too reductive? He hadn't meant any harm. It was just easy, the kind of shorthand everyone uses when they think they know someone from their movies. But now, sitting there, he wondered if he'd confused familiarity with understanding. A few tables over, a veteran cinematographer leaned toward his companion and said quietly, "You think he'll say something?" "Who, Clint?" "Nah, he doesn't do that. But he heard it." "Oh, he heard it," the other replied with a small smile. "He always hears it." The truth was, Eastwood had heard versions of that joke for over 50 years. From talk show hosts to late-night comics. From interviewers trying to be clever to fans shouting from the sidewalk. He'd been called everything from Dirty Harry to the man who talks to chairs. Most of the time, he let it slide. Not out of indifference, but because he'd long ago realized that people weren't really talking to him. They were talking to the idea of him, the myth built from decades of roles, interviews, and iconic squints. And myths, no matter how well-meaning, rarely leave room for the real person underneath. Still, there was something different about tonight. Maybe it was the setting, the intimacy of the room, the weight of the occasion, or maybe it was just timing. But as the evening wore on, a quiet understanding began to settle among those who'd been in the business long enough to recognize the difference between a caricature and a man. Later, during a brief intermission, the host found himself near the bar, pretending to check his phone while really just catching his breath. A longtime publicist he knew well sidled up beside him, ordering a soda water with lime. "You okay?" she asked, not looking at him. "Yeah, why? You seemed a little off after the monologue." He exhaled softly. "Did I cross a line with the Eastwood bit?" She took a slow sip before answering. "Not a line exactly, more like, you painted him with a brush he's tired of seeing." He didn't seem mad. "No," she said, finally turning to him. "That's the thing. He never gets mad. He just decides whether you're worth correcting." The words landed heavier than he expected. Worth correcting. It wasn't about offense, it was about respect. And in that moment, The host realized he'd treated a living legend like a prop in his act, not a person who'd shaped the very industry they were all celebrating tonight. Back at his table, he watched as Eastwood stood to greet an old friend, another director, silver-haired and leaning on a cane. They embraced like men who'd shared more than just sets. They'd shared eras. There was warmth in the way they spoke, a shorthand built over decades. No performative gestures, no grand displays, just two people who knew each other beyond headlines and red carpets. The host felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was humility. Maybe it was regret. When the program resumed, the host was called back on stage, not to joke this time, but to introduce Eastwood himself, who'd agreed at the last minute to present a Lifetime Achievement Award. The producers had scrambled to adjust the schedule, thrilled by the unexpected addition. As the host's name was announced, he stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the stage with a new kind of awareness. The spotlight hit him, and for the first time all night, he didn't feel like the center of attention. He felt like a bridge, someone stepping aside to make room for something bigger. He introduced Eastwood with genuine warmth, skipping the usual punchlines and instead speaking plainly about his impact. The films that changed cinema, the quiet integrity he brought to every project, the way he'd stayed true to his vision even when the industry shifted around him. The audience listened closely. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. Then Eastwood walked on stage. The room didn't just applaud, they rose. Not all at once, but steadily, like a wave building from the back. People stood not because they were told to, but because they felt it. There was no music, no dramatic fanfare, just the sound of respect, raw and unscripted. Eastwood took the mic, nodded to the host, and gave that half smile again, the one that said he'd seen it all and still found some of it worth smiling about. He thanked the host politely, then paused. The room held its breath. "You know," he began, voice calm but caring, "back in my day we didn't need six-shooters to handle jokes. We just waited for the punchline to run out of steam." A beat of silence. Then laughter, deeper, richer, more knowing than before. It wasn't mocking. It was shared. The host laughed too, but this time it came from a different place. He'd thrown a stone expecting a splash. Instead, he'd been handed a mirror, and in that moment the joke wasn't on Clint Eastwood anymore. It never really was. The laughter that followed wasn't loud or forced. It rolled through the room like a slow wave, warm and knowing. People weren't just laughing at the line, they were laughing with it, recognizing something true in the quiet wisdom behind it. Even those who hadn't caught the earlier joke understood the moment now. A master had just turned the tables without raising his voice, without a hint of anger, just with the kind of timing that only comes from decades of watching, listening, and choosing his words carefully. The host stood a few feet away, still holding the edge of the podium, and for the first time that night, he wasn't thinking about his next line or how the cameras were framing him. He was just there, present, humbled, and oddly grateful. He'd come into the evening thinking he was the one steering the room, but now he realized he'd been gently, firmly reminded that some people don't need to steer at all. They just stand steady and the current shifts around them. Eastwood didn't linger on the moment. He gave a small nod as if to say, "That's enough of that," and smoothly transitioned into presenting the award. His voice stayed low and steady the way it always had. No theatrical pauses, no booming declarations. He spoke about the recipient with genuine admiration, recalling a quiet conversation they'd had years ago on a film set in New Mexico, how that person had stayed late to help a young crew member fix a lighting rig, how they'd never mentioned it again, but Eastwood remembered. It wasn't the kind of story that made headlines, but it was the kind that built legacies. As he spoke, the room seemed to lean in. Phones stayed in pockets. Whispered side conversations faded. Even the waiters paused near the walls, trays in hand, listening. There was something magnetic about the simplicity of it, the lack of performance, the absence of ego. In an industry built on spectacle, this felt like a rare glimpse behind the curtain, not to expose anything, but to show that real strength often looks nothing like what we expect. When he finished, the applause was different this time, softer at first, then building into something deeper, more sustained, not just clapping for the award or the words, but for the man himself, for the quiet dignity he carried like a second skin. He stepped back from the mic, gave the host another small nod, this one feeling almost like a handshake in the air, and walked off stage the same way he'd come, Unhurried, unbothered, completely himself. Back at his table, the host sat down slowly, still processing what had just happened. He wasn't embarrassed, far from it. He felt lighter, like he'd been let off the hook with grace instead of scolded. And that, he realized, was far more powerful. It would have been easy for Eastwood to ignore him, or worse, to fire back with something cutting, but instead, he'd use the moment to teach without lecturing, to correct without condescension. It was the kind of response that didn't just shut down a joke. It reshaped the whole room's understanding of respect. A few seats away, a young writer who'd grown up watching Eastwood's films on grainy VHS tapes turned to her mentor and whispered, "Did you see that?" He didn't even raise his voice. Her mentor smiled. "That's the point. You don't need to shout when you've already earned the room's attention." Later, during a lull in the program, the host found himself near the hallway that led to the green room. He wasn't sure why he was heading that way. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, but his feet carried him there anyway. He spotted Eastwood standing near a window, looking out at the city lights, a glass of water in his hand. He wasn't surrounded by handlers or fans, just alone in the quiet he seemed to prefer. The host hesitated, then took a step forward. "Mr. Eastwood?" Eastwood turned, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Hey, I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled that up there." Eastwood gave a slight shrug. "It's all right. You were just doing your job." "Yeah, but I leaned on an old cliché. I should have known better." A pause. Then quietly, "We all do that sometimes. Mistake the shadow for the man." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy. The host nodded, not sure what else to say. He'd expected a brush-off or a polite deflection, but instead he'd been met with honesty, gentle but direct. "You've been doing this a long time," the host said after a moment. "How do you stay you, with all the noise, all the expectations?" Eastwood looked back out the window. "You stop trying to be what they think you are. You just show up as yourself. The rest takes care of itself." It wasn't a grand philosophy. It wasn't a quote for a poster. But it landed like truth. They stood in silence for a few seconds, the distant hum of the ballroom muffled behind them. Then Eastwood turned slightly. "You're good at what you do. Just remember, sometimes the best punchline is the one you don't need to say." The host smiled. "Noted." He walked back toward the main room, feeling different, not smaller but clearer, like he'd been handed a compass instead of a critique. Inside, the evening continued. Awards were given, speeches delivered, tears shed and wiped away with linen napkins. But something had shifted. The energy wasn't just celebratory anymore, it was reflective. People spoke more quietly, listened more closely. Even the jokes that followed felt more thoughtful, less reliant on easy targets. And though Eastwood returned to his seat and said little for the rest of the night, his presence lingered in every pause, every glance. Every moment someone chose kindness over cleverness. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do isn't to command the room, but to change it without ever raising their voice. Backstage, the air always felt a little different. Cooler, quieter, charged with the kind of energy that comes from people trying to hold it all together while the world watches from the other side of the curtain. After the exchange on stage, the mood shifted in ways no one had planned for. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but subtle, like the quiet hum of a room that's just realized it's been part of something real. Crew members moved with a little more care, speaking in lower voices. A makeup artist paused while touching up a presenter's foundation and said to her assistant, "Did you catch what happened out there?" The assistant nodded. "Yeah, felt like we all got a lesson without even knowing we needed one." Nearby, a stagehand leaned against a lighting rig, arms crossed, and murmured, "Man, I've worked these shows for 15 years, and that might have been the most human moment I've ever seen on that stage." It wasn't about the joke anymore. It wasn't even really about the host or Eastwood, not in the way gossip columns would later try to frame it. It was about the space between performance and personhood, the thin line everyone in that room walked every day. Most of them had spent years perfecting their public faces, learning how to smile on cue, how to deflect, how to charm. But tonight someone had shown them what it looked like to just be, without armor, without agenda. The host returned to his seat feeling oddly unburdened. He didn't check his phone for texts or scan the room for reactions. He just sat, watching the rest of the program unfold with a kind of quiet attention he hadn't allowed himself all evening. When a young actor accepted an award and choked up mid-speech, The host didn't think about how to turn it into a bit later. He just let it be what it was. A moment of real emotion in a world that often treats vulnerability like a flaw. Later, during a commercial break built into the live broadcast, he found himself near the catering table, not because he was hungry, but because it was one of the few places backstage that felt normal. Someone had left a half-eaten plate of mini quiches next to a stack of napkins. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black, lukewarm, and leaned against the wall. That's when the veteran publicist from earlier walked up, holding 2 bottles of water. "Mind if I join you in this very glamorous corner?" she asked, handing him one. He smiled. "Please. I think I've had enough spotlight for one night." She took a sip. "You handled that well, by the way. Most people would have doubled down or gotten defensive." "I thought about it," he admitted, for about 2 seconds. "Then I realized, why would I argue with someone who's been right for 60 years? She laughed softly. "He's got that effect on people. Makes you want to be better without ever asking you to." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the muffled applause from the ballroom. Then she said, "You know, I've seen a lot of legends come and go. Some burn bright and fast. Others, they just stay. And the ones who stay, they don't do it by shouting the loudest. They do it by showing up day after day as themselves." He nodded. "I think I get that now." Back in the audience, Eastwood hadn't moved much. He'd accepted a few quiet handshakes, exchanged a few words with old friends, but mostly kept to himself. At one point, a young filmmaker, barely 30, wearing a suit that still looked new, approached his table with nervous hands and asked if he could say hello. Eastwood looked up, saw the genuine awe in the kid's eyes, and gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Sure, sit." The conversation wasn't about scripts or box office numbers. It was about patience, about trusting your instincts even when the room says otherwise. The young man listened like every word mattered, which to him it did. When he finally stood to leave, he didn't ask for a photo or a favor. He just said, "Thank you for your time," and walked away with his shoulders a little straighter. That small moment didn't make the news. It wouldn't end up in a highlight reel. But it mattered, because in an industry that often measures worth by followers or premieres or red carpet appearances, real mentorship still happens in the quiet corners, over water and worn-out chairs. As the night wound down, the host found himself thinking less about his monologue and more about the kind of legacy he wanted to leave. Not just as a performer, but as a person. Did he want to be remembered for the loudest jokes or for the moments when he chose kindness over cleverness? For the times he lifted others up instead of using them as punchlines? He didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, he was asking the right questions. Later, as guests began to gather their coats and say their goodbyes, the host spotted Eastwood near the exit, speaking with a longtime collaborator. He didn't go over. He didn't need to. The moment had already passed and it had done its work. Instead, he simply watched from a distance as Eastwood gave a firm handshake, said something that made the other man laugh, and then walked out into the cool night air, alone, unhurried, completely at peace with who he was. The host turned to leave himself, stepping out onto the sidewalk where the city lights shimmered against the damp pavement. A car pulled up, but he waved it off, deciding to walk a few blocks. The night felt different now, clearer, calmer. He thought about the millions who would watch the broadcast later, laughing at the scripted bits, crying at the emotional speeches. But he wondered if any of them would catch the real story, the one that happened in the spaces between the lines, in a glance, a pause, a single sentence spoken without fanfare. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments aren't the ones that go viral. They're the ones that change a person quietly, deeply, and forever. And those, they don't need headlines, they just need to be lived. Weeks after the gala, the buzz had mostly faded. The headlines moved on to new premieres, fresh scandals, and the usual cycle of Hollywood noise. Clips from the night made their rounds online. The emotional acceptance speeches, the surprise musical performance, even a few seconds of the host's opening monologue. But the moment that mattered most, the quiet exchange between two men on a stage, that didn't trend. It didn't get turned into a meme. And maybe that was the point. The host, though, hadn't forgotten it. He found himself thinking about it more than he expected, not with embarrassment, but with a kind of steady clarity that stayed with him like a compass. He'd been invited to appear on a popular podcast, one known for deep conversations rather than gossip, and when the interviewer asked him about the night, He didn't dodge the question. He leaned into it. "I went in thinking I was there to entertain," he said, voice calm. "But I left realizing I'd been taught something." He described the joke, not to excuse it, but to own it. "It was lazy," he admitted. "I used a shortcut because it was easy, not because it was true. And Clint, he didn't shame me for it. He just showed me there was a better way." The interviewer paused. "What do you mean?" He turned the moment into something human. Not a comeback, not a burn, just a reminder that people aren't punchlines. Especially not the ones who've earned the right to be seen as they are. The episode aired on a quiet Tuesday morning and didn't make waves in the usual sense. No viral clips, no outraged think pieces. But messages started trickling in, from fellow comedians, writers, even a few fans. Not angry ones, thoughtful ones. People saying things like, "I never thought about it that way," or "Thanks for being honest about messing up." One message, from a young comic just starting out, read, "I've been using the same kind of jokes you did. After hearing you talk, I'm going to try to do better." That, more than anything, stuck with him. Meanwhile, Eastwood had returned to his routine. Early mornings, long walks, work on a new script he was shaping in his office in Carmel. He didn't watch the replay of the gala. He rarely watched himself on screen at all. But word reached him, as it sometimes did, through old friends and quiet phone calls. Someone mentioned the podcast. He listened to a portion of it while driving back from the golf course, the audio playing softly through his car speakers. When it ended, he didn't say much. Just turned off the engine, sat for a moment in the driveway, and nodded to himself, once slowly before heading inside. There was no grand follow-up, no public reconciliation or staged photo op. Just two people, miles apart, both changed in small but real ways by a single night. Back in the city, the host began adjusting his sets, not in a dramatic overhaul, but in subtle shifts. He still told jokes, still pushed boundaries, but he started asking himself a new question before every punchline. Is this about the person, or just the idea of them? Sometimes the answer meant cutting a line. Other times it meant rewriting it with more care. His audiences didn't always notice the difference, but his fellow performers did. A longtime collaborator pulled him aside after a show and said, "You've been sharper lately. Not louder, just truer," he smiled. "I'm trying." The story of that night didn't become legend. It didn't get written into books or turned into a scene in a movie. But it lived on in quieter ways, in the way the host paused before making a joke about someone's age, in the way he now made a point to learn a guest's real name before roasting them, in the extra second he took to look someone in the eye instead of just at their reputation. And for Eastwood, it was just another evening in a life full of them. Another moment where he chose presence over performance, dignity over drama. He'd never set out to teach anyone a lesson. He'd simply been himself. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing a person can offer. Months later, at a small industry gathering, nothing fancy, just a backyard dinner under string lights, the host spotted Eastwood across the patio. He wasn't surrounded by admirers. He was talking with a retired set designer, both of them laughing about some long-forgotten mishap on a film shoot from the 70s. The host didn't interrupt. He just watched for a moment, then raised his glass slightly in silent acknowledgement. Eastwood saw him, gave a small nod in return, and went back to his conversation. No words were needed. The understanding was already there. In a world that often confuses noise with impact, that night became a quiet reminder. Real influence doesn't always come from the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it comes from the one who speaks only when it matters, and chooses silence the rest of the time. And sometimes the most lasting lessons aren't delivered with fanfare, but with a single sentence spoken calmly that echoes long after the lights go down. Years from now, when people look back on that evening, they might not remember who won which award or what song was performed. But those who were there, really there, will remember how the air changed after a simple line was spoken, how a room full of polished personas softened just for a moment into something more human, and how one man, by refusing to play the caricature everyone expected, reminded everyone else what it means to show up as yourself. That's not the stuff of headlines, but it's the stuff of character. And in the end, that's what lasts.